Welcome to the Institute for Management Studies Leadership Conversations podcast, where we have leading thought leaders discussing their research and identifying ways that you can incorporate it to take your learning and development to the next level. Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to highlight relevant research and practical applications from esteemed leadership experts and practitioners. Today, I'm glad to be joined with Brenda Bailey-Hughes, who is an award-winning faculty member at the Kelley School of Business, where she teaches business communication and leadership courses. Prior to joining the Kelley School, Brenda spent nearly a decade in human resources, specializing in managerial training, mediation, and organizational development. She is a sought-after speaker and coach who frequently presents at conferences of over a dozen topics, including influence, powerful presentations, leadership through the lens of emotional intelligence, which is going to be the focus of today's episode, as well as customer service and change strategies for personal growth. Thank you for joining me today, Brenda.
Thank you, Charles. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So a little bit of background that I thought I would share with our listeners after talking to you prior to us recording this podcast is that your upcoming trip is quite unique. You're going to southern France to teach a class on design thinking, which, like you stated, is kind of at the crossroads, right, of emotional intelligence, accountability, empathy. Love to hear more about this course that you're going to teach and kind of the layout of it.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I first was invited to teach a design thinking course by a mentor of mine at the university where I teach. She came and she said, "Hey, Brenda, I've got this huge MBA cohort. They've all signed up to take this design thinking course. Could you help me?" And I said, "Design thinking? Now, Charles, you have to realize I really didn't even know what design thinking was. And she's asking me to help her. So I'm thinking, well, what does she need?" I said, "Do you need me to order the lunches? I don't even know what you want." And she kind of scoffed at me. She goes, "Well, I thought your research interests were in empathy." And I said, "Yeah, you just said design thinking. I'm an empathy expert." And she said, "Well, design thinking is just where empathy meets problem solving." And I thought, oh my goodness. And then she went on to, try to sell me on teaching this course on design thinking. But I have to tell you, Charles, she had me at empathy meets problem solving. I was all in right then. So that's how I got into doing this deep dive into the research around design thinking. And she was absolutely right. Of all the definitions of design thinking that are out there, my favorite is still where empathy meets problem solving. And my goodness, in today's world, if we've ever needed a creative approach to problem solving, a new nuanced way to problem solve, I think empathy is it.
Well, I love that definition as well. And that might be a future episode for you and I.
There we go.
So that's great content there. Why do you think now, getting more into the topic of today's episode around emotional intelligence, right? If you could just give us your definition of what is emotional intelligence.
Emotional intelligence is a psychological construct, is how it started, that helps people to be successful in their lives. And it has essentially 4 different dimensions. 2 of them are more inward facing, internal, and 2 of these dimensions are more external, action oriented versus reflection. 2 of them are about yourself and 2 of them are about others. So you've got self-awareness, which is both internal and about yourself. And then you have self-management, which is still about yourself, but now it's more about how does all that self-awareness project itself into the world? Well, it's through your self-management, your ability to manage your emotions and to manage your stress and to manage your time and to manage your life, that management piece. And then on the other side, you have focusing on others, empathy, which we've already chatted about just for a minute there. Empathy is how I internally process what I think you might be experiencing and what you might be thinking. And then relationship management is how that empathy manifests itself in the world. How does that create the rapport, the relationship, the influence that I as a leader have in the world? So those 4 dimensions create this construct of emotional intelligence.
I love your model in that construct because many people feel that it's important or know that it's needed, but they really can't define it that well or understand or wrap their heads around what does it mean, right? What is the parts of that model? Now, it's been around for a long time. Why do you think there's a resurgence right now and everyone wanting people, leaders with more EQ?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a 32-year-old term. It was coined back in 1990, popularized in the middle to late 90s when the researchers started looking at this psychological construct in the context of business settings and started realizing that leaders with these EI skills are outperforming leaders who lacked these EI skills. And so that's why it really blossomed in the 90s and then had its heyday and sat on the back burner for a moment and is, I think, resurging right now because, Charles, we've been sitting in our houses alone for 2.5 years. Our skills got rusty. I think that two things happened. One, the social skill capability, the capability of empathizing with others, we didn't know how to do it remotely. And so there was this moment of just not doing it at all. And then of sort of trying to sort out what does it look like to empathize and build relationship when so many more of my interactions are remote or are virtual. So I think that was a piece of it. And just that the isolation of the pandemic gave us time to sort of really do more of that self-reflection. And as we did that, the self-awareness may have started creeping up. And with that, this renewed interest in what emotional intelligence is. And as you said, not just, we kind of all give it a nod and say, yeah, it's important, but hey, how do I actually do it? And I think that's been my unique spin on emotional intelligence and the work in this space that I've done has been, how do we actionize it? How do we practice it? How do we actually use these skills that we hear talked about? And that is one of the most important things I think I hope your listeners hear is that these are skills and they can be learned like any other skills. So there are some people that are born with more EI than others, but we can all build, grow, and develop this. It's a learnable skill.
So it's different from IQ, where it's mainly inherent. EQ is something that you can learn as you go. And I love how you provide actionable strategies because it's not what you know, it's what you do consistently. Like I try to repeat on every episode. And this is a skill gap. And skill gaps, they need practice. They can't be where you just give them the information and then they're able to improve in that area. So I love the model and the process. And I'm excited to hear about some of those practical activities that you can give to improving each part of the model in your upcoming IMS programs. So we realize there's a need for it right now. We've gotten some understanding of really what EI is. How do people judge others in terms of their EI? Are there certain measures that they look at, certain areas that they focus on so that people can become a little more self-aware to say, am I projecting my emotions, this EI, the right way to the ones I work with, and perhaps even in non-work settings?
I love that question. So are there ways people evaluate, or what are the ways people evaluate whether we're emotionally intelligent? And it's not so much that someone would sit around and say, well, what is Charles's EQ? You know, like that's not how they're framing it. They're framing it in questions like, do I trust you? Do I feel a connection to you? Do I feel like, do I like you? I mean, it is a likability question at the end of the day to some extent. So those are the questions people are asking. And then how they evaluate that is, for example, on trust, they're looking at, do I feel like you have the skills necessary to get the job done that you say you're going to do? But maybe even before that, I'm wondering, do you have the intention to even want to do the job, to look after me, to have my back and do the job that you said that you would do? Because I don't care so much about your competency if you haven't first proven that you have care and concern. So there's these two sorts of dimensions that people are evaluating you on when they ask themselves that gut level question, do I trust you? Well, do you have the warmth, the care, the concern? Are you projecting that to me in specific ways? And do you have the competency? Do you have the credibility with me that I think, you're an expert. I think you can get it done. So I think that's some of the ways people are evaluating that. A lot of this is quick snap judgments. But one of the ways, if someone sees you not able to manage or control your emotions, that is such a slam to your emotional intelligence And people are almost unforgiving about that one. So let's say you just lose your temper just once. Your emotions got the best of you, you blew up. It is really hard to come back and recover from that. So it's much better to learn in advance how to manage those emotions so that you don't have to recover from an explosion.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's try to go through some of these steps to self-regulate when you're about to yell, to cry, to scream out. So that doesn't happen, because you're right. It's so much harder to recover than to pausing maybe prior to collect yourself before some of those emotions leak out.
Yeah, well, know your triggers to begin with. Start learning historically. When have you had strong emotional reactions? What were the triggers? Was it a certain topic that just gets under your skin that you can't stand? Is it when you're tired? Is it when you're hungry? So know your triggers. For me, it is lack of sleep. If I don't get enough sleep, and with international travel, this gets so difficult because you get on weird time zones and you've got your jet lag going. But I recognize in myself that I crumble easier. I'm much quicker to want to tear up. I'm much quicker to want to decide that, woe is me, the sky is falling, everything's horrible. And so having said that out loud to myself and to you now, I can recognize that when I'm in a situation where everything seems horrible and I'm ready to lose control, I can go, wait a minute, this is one of my triggers. I have not slept well. This is a trigger. This is a trigger. Just that in and of itself can help put things back into perspective. Maybe the sky is not about to fall. Maybe I need a nap. So know your triggers, I think helps. And then, yes, you mentioned pause, but how do we remind ourselves to pause? It's about breath work, right? Like before I say anything, I'm going to take a breath. And in that breath, I'm going to breathe in calm and I'm going to breathe out calm. Breathe in calm and I'm going to breathe out calm. So if your parents taught you count to 3 before you say anything, they weren't kidding, because that's that purposeful pause. I think another thing that can help us, Charles, managing the emotion is to recognize that thoughts lead to emotions, emotions lead to actions, right? So think about that triangle. So if I'm feeling anxious or I'm feeling angry about something and I want to break that cycle between anger and temper tantrum, maybe at the pinnacle of that triangle, the thought is what I actually need to change. So if I'm thinking, oh, this person is so evil, is so mean, is so out to get me. Well, yeah, of course, with that thought, I'm going to lead to a legitimate, valid emotion of anger that will spill into manifested behaviors of yelling, screaming, throwing, whatever. So maybe I can go back to that emotion or that thought and challenge that.
Those are great tips and advice. I like another one that you shared in the past, channeling someone, a famous person, a celebrity that exudes that quality. So if you want more patience, more calm under pressure, maybe it's James Bond, but identifying that, personifying them or him or her, and it helps.
Yes,
It
it
changes
really
your
does.
mindset until you get to the point where you feel like you can exude that quality with more confidence.
Right. And you can do it with people you know too. It doesn't have to be a celebrity. So I have a colleague who just is that epitome of cool as a cucumber, calm under pressure. And so when I'm feeling stressed, I'm like, channel Jane. What would Jane do? What would Jane say? And it is so very helpful. I think another tip in the heat of a conversation, if you're feeling that, is just to break eye contact for a minute, which it seems like the antithesis of what someone focused on communication strategies usually tells you to maintain eye contact, but break it, look down, look away if you just need a moment to regroup and to settle things down. And then really thinking about the poker face, like, okay, I may still be feeling some anxiety, some anger, some frustration with you, but it's not an appropriate time to share that. Now, think about all the situations where that's true. Caveat, there are situations where it's appropriate for me to show you my anger, and there are situations where it's appropriate for me to show you my frustration. I'm talking about the times when it's not, and we all know that we have those situations in our lives. Then one of the things you've got to work through, like I said, break that eye contact so that and take that pause, take that breath, a deep diaphragmatic breath, not a breath from up at the top of your chest, which is just going to make you sound like you're sort of panting and that anxiety comes through. But diaphragmatic breath, take your pause, break your eye contact. Maybe for pause, you could even sip a little bit of water, sip a cup of tea, take a note, get your pen out, take a note. Somehow you're buying time to take that beat that you need. And then a really simple but effective tip to keep your face as a poker face is to make sure that you drop your tongue from the roof of your mouth. When we go tense, we lock our jaw, we clench our teeth, and our tongue goes up into the roof of our mouth. And just that dropping of the tongue releases the jawline, it loosens the teeth, it calms us internally, but it also projects more of that calm out into the world. Yeah.
I love that subtle reminder as well. And even I would even take it further to say, pause. You can even pause for a day. Don't make decisions when you're charged up. Don't commit to anything. Let there be some time that passes before you really make that decision. So you make sure that it's the right decision, not just an impetuous one because of your emotions that are controlling your thought processes.
Absolutely. Practice phrases like, I need to give this some thought and get back to you. Let me ponder that. I have a 24-hour rule. I'm not going to make a decision without 24 hours. So, just have those phrases that you've already practiced into the mirror at home, ready to go when you know you're walking into a potentially contentious conversation.
And I love having both types of strategies, right? The at the moment strategies when it just happens and you need something that will calm you down, but also the preventative strategies that you can plan for and use prior to, so you become more of the person you want to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we don't have time to unpack the entire model, but I'd like to focus on one piece of the model, which I think is fundamental to emotional intelligence, and that's empathy. But it's on the decline. Why do you think that is?
I'm so glad you picked empathy. This one's my favorite. And I feel bad saying that. It's like you have 4 children and I just said I had a favorite. So I'm not sure I should have done that, but empathy does have my heart in the model. Why is empathy on the decline? It's interesting. The study that indicated that was the case, that there's been a 20-year decline in empathy, it didn't have causation. So we don't know for sure why. So I'm going to make some educated guesses though. I do think online living, social media, texting versus conversations might have had somewhat of an effect, that we just don't have the same practice of sitting in a room with people and reading the room and reading the nonverbals when such an increased percentage of our conversations are happening in texts. And therefore, I never learned that skill of reading the room, of attuning to the nonverbals of others in the room. So I think that could be a part of why we've seen an empathy decline, is that literally we just don't have the same amount of practice that we used to. Now, I could argue that on the flip side, communicating with tact and diplomacy, which is an empathy skill, is even harder to do in some respects with text and with email. So why didn't we get better at it since we're using it? But I think a lot of it is about that nonverbal read and attuning to other people's emotions. So I think that's part of it, perhaps. Yeah. And maybe very recently, now that study was a longitudinal study, but even recently, it could be some burnout. There's 2 different kinds of empathy. There's affective and cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is my ability to take your perspective, to know what you're thinking, to at least be able to view the world through your lens. Affective empathy is I feel what you feel. If you're grieving, I experience grief because of my attunement to you. Now, really interesting studies about affective empathy, that I feel what you feel, in healthcare providers, is that it actually hurt their performance because they are in such high stress situations, in such emotionally intense situations, that feeling that over and over and over again led to burnout. And then we know that people, once they're burned out, don't perform at their peak. So that's where having cognitive empathy and not affective empathy actually can be beneficial. Sometimes we have to sort of say shields up where it comes to that, feel the feeling, but still focus on, can I at least understand how you see the world and make good decisions and have good conversations based on that? So maybe in the last couple of years, we've just felt so much pain through the pain that others around us are experiencing, we're just a little burned out.
Well, having too much of that affective empathy, right? I mean, in these times where we're just taking it too personally and feeling too much of what other people do. Is there a difference between the two in terms of their effectiveness?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the definer, do I want affective or cognitive empathy? Look at your purpose in this relationship. If this is a personal relationship where I am trying to create intimacy and connection with someone, I've got to go down that affective empathy path. There's just, if I don't feel what you feel, we're never going to have that sort of connection. If I'm in a professional setting, and for example, let's say you're a manager who's really trying to work through some accountability issues with a team member, you may have to ratchet down your affective empathy in order to maintain your cognitive empathy, and still hold people accountable for the standards that need to be met. So I think you need to look at the purpose here would be a piece of it. And then when you need to make that switch, just having that vocabulary is going to help you, knowing that there's two different types of empathy and that one isn't superior or inferior to the other, but that you just have to pull on the one depending on what is needed. So, I mentioned a manager or a leader who might need to ratchet down affective empathy to boost accountability. But let's imagine another leader who has gotten some 360 feedback that says, gosh, you're brilliant and you're genius and you're hardworking, but we don't think you care about us. We're not sure you care about the people as much as you do the projects on our desks. Well, okay, that leader needs to ratchet up the affective empathy. She or he needs to spend more time getting in touch with what are my team members feeling, and can I feel that inside me? And then can I paraphrase that out to them? Can I make decisions based on that? So I think it's about purpose.
I think you're absolutely right. Let's focus on one of those scenarios because I've seen this a lot with leaders. The one in which they have too high of an affective empathy, so they might be perceived as being weak or not getting rid of certain people on their team or giving them too much leniency because they can feel so much of their situation. They feel sorry for them. How do you deal with that, manager, to push them more in the accountability piece and to bring down the dial a little bit on their empathy so they can be perceived as effective, yet still caring for that individual?
Right. Well, first I would push back to say, maybe they are being effective. Maybe, I would just push back to say, maybe the first thing that leader needs to do is to teach those that are judging him or her a little empathy too, because maybe the right decision is to hold on to this person and let them work through the life crises that has led to some poor performance. And maybe it is that the team should be lifting and supporting this person a little bit, because your time's coming when you need to be lifted and supported a little bit. So first of all, really do a deep dive into, am I honestly allowing standards to deteriorate in an unacceptable way because of the affective empathy? Or is this one of those times when standards could be met in a different way if we had some flexibility and we could still show some compassion for this person? Now, let's say that's not the scenario though, that instead that little voice in my head is saying, gosh, Joe needs to go. Right. And I don't have the heart to do it because I know he's in the middle of a divorce and he moved all the way here for this job and he's only had it for 2 years. And, I've got all this going. So then your question is great. Then like, how do I dial down affective to dial up perspective? And I think one of the techniques would be to have empathy for everybody else on the team. In my deep dive into the affective emotion that Joe is feeling, have I realized that means that Jose has had to pick up the slack and he's exhausted too. And that Jason is growing increasingly disgruntled with the mixed messages that I'm sending to the team. So I think pulling that affective out to others can help me say, okay, I've got a whole team to take care of here. And I've allowed myself to just hone in on one team member unnecessarily. And so I think that can help. I think talking to other leaders who've been down that road to say, how did you do this? And, pull to your mentors to say, how do you dial back the affective empathy? And to remember that cognitive empathy is still there and it's not inferior. So that I can still say, Joe, I know this is a horrible time for you. And I respect the amount you are still able to give. Nonetheless, this deadline has to be met. Like I can have both. I can still understand you. That doesn't mean I agree with you.
No, that's an important distinction to make, right? It's definitely that you need to make sure that they feel heard, even though you may not agree with what they're stating. Yeah. For empathy, it's our ability. So there's two parts, but are there ways that a manager, a leader, or just a person overall can jumpstart their empathetic imagination so that they feel these? So if they're not inherently strong in this area, they've had a performance review to say you really need to connect better with your group, with your team. You're not showing enough empathy. You aren't connecting with them, showing them that you care. What are a couple easy things that they maybe could do to get more skill around that?
Yeah. Don't wait for the feedback that says you lack empathy to assume that you should use these jump starts. Because first of all, that is really hard feedback to give to someone. You're rarely going to get that feedback. Secondly, it's way too late by the time you get that. No, not too late, but let's jumpstart. And everyone over emotionally intelligent as well as less emotionally intelligent people, we all overestimate our emotional intelligence. So just automatically assume that you have 25 to 50% less empathy than you think you do, because that's probably the truth. So these jump starters are not just for the person who's identified as needing more empathy. It's for all of us. And here are a couple of them. One of the things you're trying to do is to be able to take the perspective of someone else. All right. So here's a clever way to do that. Imagine things that have happened in your life, but reconstruct the timeline. So for example, I have ridden a public bus. I do have a grandson, and I have been to South Africa. I have not done those three things all together, but I could imagine myself taking a bus in South Africa with my grandson, okay? By going through that sort of imaginary process, it's not too different from stepping into the shoes of someone else. Like you're still taking feelings that you've felt, but they're someone else's. You're taking experiences that you haven't had because they're someone else's, but that you can relate to, and you're playing with them. So that is an exercise that warms up or ignites the empathic imagination. Another one is to read literary fiction. Read books that have people and places and times that are living a life you have not experienced. And that opens you up to different experiences. Again, igniting the empathic imagination. And one of my other favorite tips for igniting your imagination, and this one's bringing lots of voices to the table. If you're going to have an interesting conversation, but everybody at the table thinks like you, lives like you, acts like you're not really working towards new perspectives. So I think those are three quick ways to ignite empathic imagination.
I love those. And those are great tips for people to start doing right away and easy enough to do tomorrow. So as we reach the end of each episode, I always like to ask my guest to say, if there was one piece of advice around this topic of emotional intelligence that you could give your younger self that you wish you had known, what would that piece of advice be to help you lead a more emotionally intelligent, be stronger in this trait as a leader?
Yeah. Empathy is undervalued and misunderstood. It is not a marshmallow. Marshmallows are sickeningly sweet and sticky and quick to melt. That's what people think empathy is. It's not. Empathy requires immense amounts of courage, immense amounts of vulnerability, and will make me a far better people leader than not having it. I wish my younger self knew that.
I love that piece of advice. Thank you, Brenda, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Find me on my LinkedIn page or look for me through the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University.
Thank you for joining me today once again, and thank all of you. This concludes our episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send me your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, it can be found both on Apple and Spotify. and also accessed on our website, which is ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know that makes a difference, it's what you do consistently.